On the pitch-black night of August 21, 1942, a narrow sandbar on Guadalcanal became the site of a terrifying collision. Hundreds of elite Japanese infantrymen charged across the lagoon in absolute darkness. The American Marines holding the opposite bank were virtually blind. They could hear the water splashing and the shouts echoing just yards away, but they could not see the advancing enemy. Yet, instead of chaotic panic, these blind defenders unleashed a perfectly orchestrated, devastating wall of lead that instantly shattered the assault. How do you annihilate an overwhelming enemy force in total darkness when you cannot even see what you are shooting at? The Battle of the Tenaru is often heavily romanticized in post-war memoirs and cinema, usually framed as a desperate, chaotic struggle of raw marine grit and spontaneous heroism against impossible odds. But military forensics and archival combat logs reveal a much colder, far more mechanical reality. This engagement was not won by superior night vision, individual bravery, or sheer luck. It was a calculated triumph of pure geometry, meticulous logistics, and rigid fire control over human momentum. We are going to deconstruct how a predefined system of interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and absolute trigger discipline systematically dismantled an elite Japanese regiment, permanently changing the tactical blueprint of the Pacific War. On that narrow sandbar, the Marines realized that in the suffocating darkness of the jungle, human sight was completely useless. Courage alone would not stop a massed infantry charge. Instead, mathematical precision and mechanical discipline had to replace human senses. The defenders created an impenetrable, invisible grid of destruction where every machine gun burst and artillery shell had a predetermined destination long before the enemy even arrived. It was the ultimate collision between the romanticized myth of close-quarters combat and the cold, terrifying reality of a perfectly engineered defensive trap. But to understand exactly how this lethal, mathematical kill zone was constructed and why a veteran Japanese commander confidently marched his men directly into it, we have to look at the severe tactical blind spots and immense logistical disadvantages both sides faced just hours before the first shot was fired. By the second week of August 1942, the 1st Marine Division found itself in a profoundly precarious situation, effectively abandoned on a hostile, disease-ridden island at the extreme edge of American strategic reach. The initial amphibious landings on Guadalcanal had achieved near-total tactical surprise, allowing the Marines to swiftly capture an unfinished Japanese airstrip that would soon be christened Henderson Field. But that rapid initial success had quickly unraveled into a nightmare of strategic isolation. Following a devastating and chaotic naval defeat in the dark waters around Sabo Island, the United States Navy had withdrawn its carrier groups and surface screening forces. Crucially, the Navy took the vital transport ships with them before the vast majority of the Marines' heavy equipment, medical supplies, defensive ordnance, and food rations could be unloaded onto the beaches. Over 10,000 American troops were suddenly left completely on their own, clinging to a narrow, roughly elliptical perimeter surrounding the vital airstrip. They were subsisting on twice-a-day rations of captured, insect-infested Japanese rice, suffering from early outbreaks of debilitating dysentery, and meticulously rationing their limited supply of ammunition. Their posture was entirely defensive, forced upon them by logistical starvation. The dense, towering jungle canopy immediately beyond their concertina wire was a terrifying black box, an uncharted, hostile expanse that belonged entirely to the enemy. Meanwhile, nearly 3,000 miles away, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo was analyzing the sudden American landing through a lens of profound miscalculation and institutional arrogance. The intelligence filtering back to the Japanese High Command was not just inaccurate, it was fatally flawed. Because the initial American landing had faced minimal organized resistance, Japanese planners simply did not assess the operation as a full-scale, division-level invasion intended to permanently seize and hold the island. Instead, they confidently believed the American presence was merely a large, temporary raiding party, perhaps 2,000 troops at most, poorly organized, severely undersupplied, and rapidly losing their combat nerve in the harsh tropical environment. Based on this catastrophic intelligence failure, the response dictated by the Japanese command was not to organize a massive, overwhelming counter-invasion fleet. Instead, they ordered a swift, surgical eradication force, designed to quickly sweep the supposedly weak, demoralized American detachment back into the sea before they could finish constructing the airfield. This critical mission was assigned to Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki and his 28th Infantry Regiment. Ichiki was a hardened, highly respected combat veteran of the brutal campaigns in Manchuria and mainland China. His men were elite, heavily combat-tested, fiercely disciplined, and exceptionally trained in the complex art of night fighting. On August 18th, under the cover of darkness, Ichiki landed at Taivu Point, roughly 20 miles east of the Marine defensive perimeter, coming ashore with a vanguard of just over 900 soldiers. Driven by the dangerously flawed intelligence that vastly underestimated both the size and the defensive readiness of the American forces, and anxious to achieve a rapid, glorious victory, Ichiki made a fateful logistical decision of his own. He did not wait for the rest of his regiment to be ferried to the island. He deliberately left behind his heavier artillery pieces, his rear echelon support units, and his critical supply trains, choosing instead to advance immediately through the jungle with his highly mobile, lightly armed first echelon. From Colonel Ichiki's perspective, this was not an act of blind arrogance or foolish bravado. It was a textbook, entirely rational tactical decision. The established doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army heavily emphasized the psychological shock of rapid, aggressive night assaults to break enemy morale and overwhelm fixed positions. If the Americans were truly as few in number and as demoralized as the Imperial intelligence reports explicitly claimed, 900 elite Japanese infantrymen charging out of the darkness with fixed bayonets would easily shatter their fragile lines. But as Ichiki's vanguard hacked their way westward through the dense, sweltering coastal jungle, the Marines were grappling with their own terrifying tactical reality. The eastern edge of the American defensive perimeter was anchored along the steep, muddy banks of a stagnant tidal lagoon known to the locals as the Ilu River, though heavily flawed American military maps mistakenly labeled it as the Tenaru. The Marine commanders implicitly understood the tactical doctrine of their adversary. They knew the Japanese heavily favored attacking under the cover of night to neutralize the significant American advantages in automatic firepower and artillery. And on Guadalcanal, nightfall brought an absolute, suffocating darkness. The towering triple canopy jungle was so dense that it completely blocked out the moonlight and the starlight. Without radar installations, without infrared scopes, and completely lacking any modern night vision technology, the Marines knew with absolute certainty that if a major Japanese attack came after sunset, they would be fighting completely blind. In this environment, relying on standard human sight to defend a perimeter was a guaranteed death sentence. If a Marine rifleman or machine gunner waiting on the defensive line held his fire until he could visually identify the silhouette of a charging Japanese soldier in the pitch black, it would be far too late. By the time the enemy was visible, they would already be within bayonet range, and the thin defensive line would be instantly overrun by the sheer momentum of hundreds of running men. Therefore, the American command realized they had to completely remove human vision from the defensive equation. The solution to this terrifying problem lay in the specific, unforgiving geography of the Ilu River itself. The river was deep, heavily choked with rotting vegetation, and flanked on both sides by thick, impassable jungle vines. However, right where the stagnant river met the rolling surf of the Pacific Ocean, the shifting tidal currents had built up a narrow, flat sandbar. This strip of sand was roughly 30 yards wide and perhaps 100 feet long, essentially forming a natural open land bridge that sealed off the lagoon from the sea. If Colonel Ichiki wanted to strike the eastern flank of Henderson Field quickly and maintain the terrifying momentum of a massed infantry charge, he could not afford to slow his men down by forcing them to wade chest-deep through the muddy, obstacle-ridden waters of the river upstream. The terrain dictated his path. He would have to use the sandbar. It was a geographic bottleneck, a fatal funnel that would forcefully compress any attacking formation, stripping away their ability to maneuver and forcing them to cross an open expanse entirely devoid of natural cover. The Marines recognized immediately that this 30-yard stretch of flat sand was the vital hinge upon which their entire survival depended. Because they simply could not rely on their eyes to fight in the dark, they had to turn this specific piece of coastal geography into a lethal, mathematical choke point during the daylight hours. The defense of the perimeter could not be reactive. It had to be entirely proactive, and rigidly mechanized. The physical space itself had to be engineered so that when the blinding darkness finally fell, every weapon along the Marine line was already locked into an unalterable geometry of destruction. If a defender pulled a trigger in the dead of night, they did not need to see what they were shooting at, as long as the weapon itself was firmly anchored on a predetermined trajectory that directly intersected with that specific patch of sand. Both forces were now rapidly converging on this single, narrow strip of beach under extreme resource constraints and massive information gaps. Colonel Ichiki was confidently marching 900 elite men straight toward a trap he did not know existed, fully expecting to find the panicked, disorganized remnant of a minor raiding party. Meanwhile, the Marines were meticulously engineering a blind kill zone, fully aware that a massive, violent assault was inevitable. But preparing the perfect mechanical trap in the bright light of day is fundamentally useless if you are fighting completely blind in the jungle and you have absolutely no idea exactly when the enemy will finally step into it. The meticulously calculated kill zone at the river mouth was completely ready, but a trap without a trigger is useless. The Marines had engineered a fatal funnel on the sandbar, yet the jungle canopy hid the one piece of intelligence they desperately needed: the exact timing of the assault. That information vacuum violently collapsed just hours before nightfall on August 20th, not through advanced naval reconnaissance, but through the staggering endurance of a single local scout. A figure stumbled out of the dense brush and collapsed near the Marine perimeter. It was Jacob Vuza, a retired Solomon Islands police sergeant who had volunteered to scout for the Americans. Captured earlier by a Japanese patrol from Colonel Ichiki's advancing vanguard, Vuza had been tied to a tree, interrogated, severely bayoneted, and left to bleed out. Instead of dying, he chewed through his bindings and crawled miles through the jungle to reach the American lines. Refusing medical treatment until he delivered his message, Vuza gasped out a precise warning to the commanders of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. An overwhelming Japanese force was moving rapidly down the coast. The attack was coming tonight. Colonel Ichiki's anticipated element of surprise was instantly vaporized. The Marines now knew exactly when the blow would land, but knowing the enemy is coming does not lift the blinding shroud of a Guadalcanal night. The darkness would still be absolute. Instead of frantically scrambling to adjust their lines or sending out desperate patrols to meet the threat in the dark, the American defenders made a cold, calculated decision. They simply locked their daytime preparations permanently into place. Along the west bank of the river, the heavy weapons crews went to work. The core of their defense relied on the Browning M1917A water-cooled machine guns, massive weapons designed for sustained, relentless fire. To ensure their blind, sweeping barrages would perfectly cover the single strand of barbed wire strung across the sandbar without accidentally hitting their own flanking positions, the gunners had to remove all human error from the equation. They took heavy mallets and drove the thick metal spades of their tripods deeply into the hard dirt. They buried the tripod legs, packing the earth down tight, effectively bolting the weapons into the geography of the island itself. The violent recoil of continuous automatic fire would not be allowed to shift the barrel a single fraction of an inch. Next, they engaged the traversing and elevating mechanisms beneath the guns. The gunners carefully dialed in the exact mechanical limits of their fire, setting rigid physical traverse stops on the base rings. In the pitch black, a gunner would not need to aim, and he would not need to see. He would simply squeeze the trigger and swing the weapon back and forth, knowing the mechanism would hit a solid steel block the millisecond before the barrel swept over friendly territory. They were establishing an unbending, invisible corridor of flying lead, suspended precisely knee-high across the open sandbar. This required an unnatural level of discipline. Human instinct during a night attack is to fire at sudden shadows or to swing the weapon toward the loudest noise. The Marines had to suppress that survival urge entirely. They had to surrender their autonomy to the machine, trusting the mathematics of their traverse stops over their own eyes and ears. With the guns bolted into place and the coordinates locked, the Marines waited in the suffocating darkness for an enemy they still could not see. At exactly 1:30 on the morning of August 21st, the suffocating silence of the Guadalcanal jungle was shattered. not by the crack of a rifle, but by the terrifying, synchronized roar of a massed infantry charge. Out of the pitch-black tree line on the eastern bank of the Ilu River, the vanguard of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment surged forward. They did not creep. They did not attempt to stealthily infiltrate the American lines. Operating strictly by the established doctrines of the Imperial Japanese Army, they launched a screaming, full-sprint frontal assault directly across the narrow 30-yard sandbar that bridged the lagoon and the ocean. Hundreds of heavily armed, fiercely disciplined veterans drove forward in a tight, rapidly moving formation, their bayonets fixed, their officers leading with drawn swords. As the boots of the first echelon hit the soft sand of the spit, the psychological expectations of the Japanese attackers were at their absolute peak. This was the exact maneuver that had broken the morale of entrenched defenders across the Asian mainland for a decade. The shock of the sudden noise, the terrifying aggression of a human wave materializing out of the absolute dark, and the sheer momentum of elite infantry closing the distance to hand-to-hand range in seconds were designed to paralyze an enemy. Colonel Ichiki's men fully expected to find a disorganized, terrified American raiding party on the opposite bank, troops who would either fire wildly into the dark or completely abandon their positions in sheer panic. The Japanese doctrine relied on this human frailty. They were projecting maximum psychological terror to force a collapse of the American lines before a cohesive defense could even be organized. Instead, the charging Japanese infantry ran directly into a relentless, unfeeling mechanical meat grinder. On the western bank, the Marines of the 2nd Battalion did not panic. They did not fire their rifles blindly into the dark. In fact, the individual riflemen largely held their fire entirely in those opening seconds. The defense of the sandbar had not been entrusted to the nervous trigger fingers of individual sentries trying to peer through the gloom. It had been handed over entirely to the heavy weapons companies, and specifically to the meticulously calibrated geometry of the Browning M1917A1 water-cooled machine guns. When the unmistakable sound of hundreds of rushing men and roaring battle cries echoed across the lagoon, the Marine machine gunners simply gripped the spade handles of their weapons, depressed the heavy thumb triggers, and slammed their barrels against the preset metal traverse stops they had bolted into the dirt hours earlier. They did not aim at the enemy because they could not see the enemy. They aimed at the mathematical grid. Instantly, an impassable horizontal wall of heavy 30 caliber bullets materialized just inches above the surface of the sandbar. Because the heavy tripods had been physically buried and locked into the earth, the violent recoil of the automatic fire did not disrupt the trajectory. The guns chattered at a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute, sweeping precisely back and forth between the unyielding steel blocks of the traverse mechanisms. The gunners simply rode the vibration of the weapon, trusting the daytime engineering over their nighttime instincts. The intersecting fields of fire from the flanking positions on the west bank created a perfect enfilade, meaning the bullets were not just flying directly at the front of the Japanese formation, but slicing horizontally through the flanks of the charging columns, maximizing the destructive potential of every single round. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The first wave of Ichiki's elite veterans simply ceased to exist as a cohesive combat formation. The invisible plane of flying lead sheared through the darkness at knee and waist height, immediately severing the momentum of the charge. The Japanese attackers were not fighting frightened young men peering over sandbags. They were violently colliding with an industrial threshing machine that felt no fear, required no light, and operated purely on the cold physics of kinetic energy and predetermined spatial coordinates. But the machine guns were only the first layer of this rigidly engineered kill zone. As the deafening roar of the heavy Brownings echoed back into the jungle, signaling that the trap had been sprung, a completely different set of mathematical equations was instantly activated, a mile behind the Marine lines. Deep inside the perimeter, the artillerymen of the 11th Marines and the crews of the heavy 81mm mortars stood ready beside their weapons. They were entirely disconnected from the chaos at the river mouth. They could not see the jungle, the lagoon, or the sandbar. They could only see the illuminated dials of their panoramic sights, glowing faintly in the deep darkness. Days prior, the forward observers had meticulously mapped the coordinates of the sandspit. They had calculated the exact elevation, deflection, propellant charge, and time of flight required to drop a high-explosive shell directly into the center of that 30-yard bottleneck. These were known as pre-registered fires. The mathematical solutions had already been solved, written down, and dialed into the firing mechanisms of the 75mm pack howitzers. When the field telephones buzzed in the artillery fire direction centers, there was no frantic request for target descriptions. There was no need for a forward observer to call in creeping adjustments, asking the guns to shift left, right, add, or drop range. The observer simply transmitted a brief, predetermined code word that corresponded to the pre-calculated grid over the sandbar. Within seconds, the night sky above Henderson Field was torn open by the concussive shockwaves of the 75mm howitzers and the hollow, rhythmic thumping of the heavy mortars leaving their tubes. The artillery crews did not require a single shred of visual confirmation. They operated in a closed loop of blind logistics, furiously passing heavy steel projectiles from the ammunition dumps, slamming them into the breaches, pulling the lanyards, and resetting the actions. The howitzers were locked onto their azimuths. The plunging fire arched high into the black, tropical sky, tracing an invisible, parabolic arc over the heads of the defending Marines, completely bypassing the jungle canopy and beginning its terminal descent precisely toward the predetermined grid. Down on the sandbar, the situation for the Japanese forces was rapidly deteriorating into an unprecedented nightmare. The initial shock of the machine gun fire had halted the vanguard, pinning the survivors down on the flat, exposed sand. But the rear echelons of the 28th Regiment, still blindly following their orders and completely unaware of the massacre occurring at the river mouth, continued to surge out of the jungle, pressing forward into the backs of the pinned troops, desperately trying to force the momentum of the charge through the bottleneck. The fatal funnel was rapidly filling with tightly packed, highly aggressive infantrymen. Then, the sky began to shriek. The pre-registered artillery and mortar shells began detonating with terrifying precision, not randomly across the battlefield, but saturating the exact geometric center of the sandbar. The high-explosive ordnance slammed into the densely packed Japanese ranks, converting the narrow spit of land into a cauldron of concussive force, flying sand, and jagged steel fragmentation. Because the coordinates had been perfectly mapped during the daylight, the 75mm shells did not stray into the Marine lines just 50 yards away on the opposite bank. They dropped ruthlessly into the designated kill box, creating a barrier of continuous explosions that sealed off the sandbar from the eastern jungle. As the slaughter escalated and the minutes dragged on, a profound psychological shift rippled through the ranks of the Japanese forces pinned down in the sand and mud. The supreme, arrogant confidence that had propelled them out of the jungle just moments before evaporated, violently replaced by severe alarm, and then by a cold, devastating realization. Colonel Ichiki's men were heavily combat-tested veterans. They had fought their way across the massive expanses of China. They inherently understood the fluid dynamics of an infantry firefight. They knew how to suppress an enemy, how to flank a strong point, and how to exploit a gap in a defensive line. But as they lay pressed against the shifting sand of Guadalcanal, illuminated only by the strobing flashes of detonating mortar shells and the relentless, intersecting streams of green and red tracer fire, they recognized the terrifying nature of the trap they had marched into. They were not fighting a human enemy who could be intimidated, suppressed, or broken by sheer aggression. They were fighting a rigid mathematical grid. The realization was paralyzing. A standard defensive line possesses human flaws. An exhausted sentry blinks. A frightened rifleman shoots high. A machine gunner panics and sweeps his weapon too far to the left, opening a momentary gap on the right. But the mechanized defense the Marines had engineered possessed none of these vulnerabilities. The traverse stops bolted onto the Brownings did not allow the guns to drift. The artillery coordinates dialed into the howitzers did not care how fiercely the Japanese officers waved their swords, or how loudly the infantrymen screamed their battle cries. Bravery, discipline, and martial spirit, the absolute core tenets of the Imperial Japanese Army's tactical philosophy, were suddenly rendered entirely irrelevant. You cannot bayonet a spatial coordinate. You cannot intimidate a predetermined trajectory. Desperation set in, but it was a calculated professional desperation. The surviving Japanese officers and non-commissioned officers refusing to accept the failure of the assault, desperately attempted to maneuver their men out of the fatal funnel. They understood that the center of the sandbar was a death trap, so they sought the edges. Under the punishing weight of the continuous fire, small squads of Japanese veterans began low-crawling aggressively toward the flanks, probing for any gap in the overlapping arcs of the American weapons. Some squads attempted to slide northward, pushing themselves directly into the rolling, dark surf of the Pacific Ocean. They hoped that by wading out into the deeper water, they could bypass the machine gun fire concentrated on the sand and outflank the Marine positions on the beach. But the American mathematical model had accounted for the tide. As the Japanese waded waist-deep into the salt water, they triggered the secondary arcs of fire. The Marines manning the flanking positions along the beach simply engaged their own predetermined traverse stops, sweeping the surf zone with the same blind, mechanical precision. The water offered no cover. It only slowed the attackers down, turning them into trapped, slow-moving targets caught in the enfilade. Simultaneously, other Japanese squads attempted to maneuver southward, sliding off the sandbar and plunging directly into the stagnant, vegetation-choked mud of the Ilu River Lagoon. They sought to use the steep, muddy banks as defilade, a physical shield against the flat trajectories of the heavy machine guns, but the terrain that offered them protection from the direct fire perfectly exposed them to the plunging fire. The moment the Japanese shifted their mass into the lagoon, the Marine 81mm mortars, communicating through sound-powered field telephones, smoothly adjusted their pre-registered coordinates. The mortar crews shifted their tubes a fraction of an inch and began dropping high-explosive rounds directly into the shallow, confined waters of the river. The water amplified the concussive shock waves of the detonations, turning the lagoon into a liquid trap with zero visibility and no avenue of escape. Every tactical maneuver the Japanese veterans attempted was immediately countered by a pre-planned geometric solution. The attackers were completely denied any safe approach. The overlapping arcs of fire aggressively pushed them back into the center of the sandbar, funneling them repeatedly into the primary kill zone, where the heavy Brownings continued their relentless, sweeping motion. The offensive momentum was entirely broken, turning elite attackers into trapped, helpless victims of industrial warfare. Yet, executing this flawless defensive doctrine required a grueling, exhausting logistical effort from the Marines operating the machinery. A kill zone of this magnitude consumes resources at an astronomical rate, and the physical toll of sustaining the mathematical grid was immense. Inside the heavy weapons emplacements on the West Bank, the environment was a chaotic, deafening microcosm of industrial labor. The Browning machine guns, firing continuously in the humid, stagnant jungle air, rapidly began to generate massive amounts of thermal energy. The thick metal barrels grew blistering hot. The heavy canvas water jackets that encased the barrels, designed to absorb the heat, began to boil violently. Steam hissed and vented through the condenser hoses, filling the dark gun pits with a scalding metallic fog. The mechanical discipline required to keep the system operational was absolute. The assistant gunners had to operate purely by touch in the suffocating darkness, furiously linking heavy fabric belts of .30 caliber ammunition, ensuring the brass cartridges were perfectly aligned so the weapon would not jam. A single misaligned round, a single failure to clear a stoppage, would immediately collapse a vital sector of the geometric grid, creating the exact gap the surviving Japanese infantry were desperately hunting for. Furthermore, the boiling water in the cooling jackets was evaporating. If a water jacket ran dry, the barrel would warp and melt within minutes under the extreme friction of continuous automatic fire, rendering the weapon permanently useless. In the chaotic darkness, ammunition carriers were not only hauling incredibly heavy wooden crates of belted ammunition up to the firing line, but they were frantically searching for any available liquid to pour into the condenser cans to keep the guns running. The logistics of the slaughter required a constant, unbroken chain of physical labor, feeding raw materials into the mechanical threshing machine just as fast as it was expelling them. Across the narrow river, the dynamic of the battle had stabilized into a horrific equilibrium. The Japanese forces could not advance through the impenetrable wall of lead and high explosives, yet their strict operational code and the rigid orders of Colonel Ichiki completely forbade them from retreating back into the jungle. They were locked in place, absorbing punishing casualties in a desperate bid to maintain a foothold on the edge of the American perimeter. For the Marines, The operation was proceeding exactly as the tactical manuals dictated. The integration of the infantry heavy weapons and the supporting artillery grids was functioning with a devastating, cold efficiency. They had successfully replaced the fragility of human sight with the absolute certainty of pre-calculated mathematics. The trap had closed exactly as designed, and the enemy was bleeding out within its confines. But as the initial shock of the assault transitioned into a prolonged, grueling siege in the dark, the limits of the American mechanized defense began to strain against the extreme, raw human aggression of the Imperial Japanese Army. The Japanese were trapped, but they were not broken, and the sheer volume of troops Colonel Ichiki had committed to the narrow bottleneck meant the pressure on the Marine lines was unrelenting. Ammunition stockpiles began to dwindle. The machine guns grew dangerously hot. The deafening, continuous roar of the artillery could not entirely mask the sounds of Japanese wire cutters crawling through the mud, probing closer to the American lines. It appeared to be a flawless execution of defensive doctrine. The geometry had held against the first terrifying impact of the human wave. But as the dark hours of the early morning dragged on, the sheer friction of sustained combat began to assert itself over the pristine daytime calculations. The heavy weapons crews knew that a single jammed bolt, a single severed field telephone wire cutting off the artillery, or a single moment of exhausted hesitation could instantly unravel the entire invisible grid. They were succeeding in their blind defense, but the cold reality of warfare was slowly creeping into the gun pits. No mathematical model survives contact with the enemy entirely intact. The historical lens often sanitizes this engagement as an effortless, one-sided dynamic of industrialized slaughter against a suicidal enemy, but the terrifying reality on the riverbank was far more precarious. The absolute mathematical certainty of the American grid began to erode under the raw pressure of human attrition and the inescapable friction of darkness. The sheer disciplined mass of Colonel Ichiki's regiment began to test the limits of the geometric model. Japanese infantry, navigating the shifting channels of fire and utilizing brief gaps in the artillery barrages, utilized strict noise discipline to probe the Marine perimeter. Using heavy wire cutters and intense physical momentum, small squads of Japanese veterans physically breached the single strand of concertina barbed wire at several points, particularly along the soft, muddy edges where the lagoon met the jungle tree line. In these dark corners, the pre-planned mechanical defense catastrophically dissolved into savage, primal, close-quarters combat. The heavy M1917 Browning machine guns, which had been physically bolted into the earth to cover the predefined spatial coordinates, were utterly useless against an enemy soldier sitting directly inside their firing pits. The traverse stops prevented the barrels from swinging inward to clear their own positions. American gunners and ammunition carriers were forced to abandon their automatic weapons, resorting to pistols, trench knives, bayonets, and entrenching tools in a desperate, chaotic scramble in the mud to maintain the vital eastern edge of the Henderson Field perimeter. While the defensive line was violently buckling and about to snap, the Marines utilized pre-calculated logistics and engineering to fight back the darkness. Anti-tank crews along the beach ceased firing high explosives and began loading 37mm canister shots, giant shotgun shells filled with hundreds of heavy steel balls. They aimed this point-blank enfilade fire precisely across the sandbar, while the mortar crews deep inside the perimeter launched illumination star shells. Suddenly, the absolute darkness was violently torn away by intense amber glow of flares hovering over the battlefield. The artificial noon was the critical turning point. Sight was restored, and the chaotic scramble immediately resolved into a mechanized cleansing. The heavy Browning gunners, visually verifying their lanes of fire, systematically stripped away the Japanese infiltration groups inside the wire, slammed the geometric door shut on the sandspit, and re-established the total precision of the defensive grid just as the perimeter was about to crack. The geometry had held, but the American Marines had survived the blackest hours of the tropical night by the narrowest of margins. As the relentless sun began to rise over the horizon, the terrifying, pulsing amber light of the flares was replaced by the cold clarity of day, and the true, sickening scale of the logistical slaughter was finally about to be exposed to the world. The tropical sun burned through the morning mist, illuminating the 30-yard sandspit in excruciating detail. For the Marines manning the heavy Browning emplacements, the cold light of day provided the first visual confirmation of their blind geometry. The natural land bridge was entirely covered by the shattered, static remnants of the Japanese vanguard. The mathematical trap had functioned with a terrifying industrial efficiency. But the engagement was not yet over. Several hundred of Colonel Ichiki's elite veterans had survived the nighttime meat grinder. Cut off from retreat and strictly adhering to their operational code, they had dug into the root systems of a dense coconut grove just across the lagoon on the eastern bank. Under the cover of darkness, their massed infantry charge had been a terrifying existential threat, but in the stark daylight, completely stripped of their momentum and mobility, they were merely a trapped, static enemy. The Marine Command did not intend to allow Ichiki's forces to regroup or wait for the sun to set again. The tactical imperative shifted instantly from a desperate, localized defense to a calculated, aggressive extermination. Elements of the 1st Marines were ordered to cross the Ilu River further upstream, hacking through the dense jungle to loop around behind the Japanese positions. This wide flanking maneuver effectively sealed the eastern perimeter, boxing the surviving Japanese infantry into a rapidly shrinking pocket pressed hard against the Pacific Ocean. To systematically collapse that pocket, the Marines deployed a completely unequal technological advantage. The heavy, rhythmic clanking of steel treads echoed over the sound of the surf as a platoon of M3 Stuart light tanks rolled directly across the disputed sandbar. Weighing 15 tons each and heavily armored against standard infantry rifles, the Stuarts represented a mechanical nightmare for a lightly equipped Japanese echelon that had deliberately left its heavy anti-tank ordnance behind to increase its marching speed. The tanks pushed relentlessly into the coconut grove, operating with absolute impunity. They did not simply provide fire support, they became blunt instruments of physical clearance. The mechanized armor swept down the beach, their 37mm main guns firing localized blasts of canister shot, while their heavy steel treads systematically dismantled the defensive pockets hidden in the underbrush. The Japanese veterans, heavily conditioned to never surrender, desperately attempted to counter the armored assault with magnetic mines and infantry rifles, but the effort was entirely futile against the cold, unyielding weight of American machinery. The Stuarts physically pinned the remnants of the detachment against the deep water of the ocean, relentlessly finishing in the bright sunlight what the pre-registered artillery had started in the pitch black. It was a methodical, daylight eradication that stripped away any remaining illusions of a romantic, close-quarters infantry duel. By late afternoon, the heavy grinding of the tank treads and the sporadic chatter of rifle fire finally ceased. The sandbar was finally quiet. But what happened here in the dark would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the entire Pacific War. We return to the terrifying question posed at the very beginning of this engagement. How do you annihilate an overwhelming enemy force in absolute darkness when you cannot even see what you are shooting at? The Marines holding the line at the Tenaru survived that night not because they possessed superior night vision, and certainly not because they were inherently braver than the veteran soldiers charging across the lagoon. They survived because they understood a fundamental, ruthless truth of modern combat. In the complete absence of human sight, mechanical discipline and cold preparation must completely take over. By physically locking their heavy weapons into a predetermined, unalterable geometry during the bright hours of daylight, the American defenders systematically removed human panic, instinct, and sensory limitation from the defensive equation. They replaced the fragile, unreliable human senses with sheer industrial lethality. The machine gunners and artillery crews did not need to see the enemy advancing through the blackness. They only needed to trust the rigorous mathematics of their traverse stops and the pre-registered coordinates mapped out by their forward observers. This horrific collision on a narrow strip of sand did far more than just halt a localized counterattack to protect an unfinished airstrip. It violently shattered a foundational pillar of Imperial Japanese military doctrine. For a decade, the Japanese High Command had operated on the deeply ingrained, almost mythological belief that supreme spiritual superiority and aggressive infantry spirit could naturally overcome any material, logistical, or technological disadvantage. Colonel Ichiki had confidently marched his elite regiment directly into the dark, firmly believing that absolute martial devotion and the sheer terror of a night assault would easily break a static defense. But the Battle of the Tenaru proved definitively that spiritual momentum and aggressive human courage could not overcome a synchronized, pre-calculated network of American firepower. war. A fierce battle cry could not deflect a plunging, high-explosive mortar shell, and supreme infantry discipline could not survive an intersecting, knee-high grid of heavy machine gun fire. The conflict at the river mouth resolved in the absolute, uncompromising victory of cold, mechanical logistics over a romanticized, spiritual warrior ethos. As the heavy gun barrels finally began to cool and the harsh, cordite smoke drifted away across the Pacific Ocean, the battle was definitively over, leaving a stark, undeniable lesson written permanently into the bloody sand. Ultimately, at the mouth of the Tenaru River, the suffocating tropical darkness did not grant the Imperial Japanese Army the decisive tactical cover they had so confidently expected. Instead, it merely forced the heavily outnumbered Marines to eliminate human vulnerability from their lines, engineering a perimeter where the limitations of sight became entirely irrelevant. By stripping away the unreliability of nighttime vision, the American defenders systematically turned the entire battlefield into a cold, inescapable mathematical equation. On that narrow sandbar, the blind, unforgiving certainty of pre-calculated trajectories permanently erased the myth of the invincible night assault, proving that in the darkest corners of the Pacific, rigid geometry would ruthlessly dictate the future of the war.